So there was a story in the news that got me thinking recently about coronavirus. Obviously, only thing in the news. Um, so it was, I guess, it was either yesterday or maybe the day before. George W. Bush gave a speech or released a statement about the situation we're going through, and I don't remember it exactly, but the gist of it was about unity and trying to put aside our differences and come together, in this crazy time, and that's what America's all about, and a lot of things you would expect the president to say, and true, right? A lot of it true. Things we do need. So he was getting some positive press on that. And that was a minor story, but the big story came when Trump commented on it. And to be honest, I don't even know exactly what he said, which is problematic right off the bat. But I'm not really drawing any conclusions directly off that for my point in this. But supposedly he said some bad things about George W. Bush and kind of knocked him a little bit, as if there was some sort of competition between them or something. But anyway, he put him down. So what I've seen a lot in the news is that story of Trump lashing out and President George W. Bush being so presidential, and that's what a president's supposed to be. And this is, look at Trump, by contrast. And it's an interesting story. You can go into a whole video series on itself about Trump's personality and his inability to let anything said or anything that takes away from his views or his ego, how he can't let it slide, how he only sees people as kind of enemies or loyalists, and he attacks his enemies relentlessly, and just how petty he is, right, and insecure. A whole bunch of stuff we could talk about, but another time. What was interesting to me about this one is, it doesn't take much to start to see, the first level of it. The first level of it is, hey, Trump, that's what you should be. That's what a president looks like. And look, it's a Republican, so it can happen. It can be a Republican. That's what you should be. And we can all applaud him, and even Democrats and liberals will applaud George W. Bush's statement. So Trump, be more like him. And to some extent, obviously, right? I think all of us would hope that to some extent, or most of us would. But then you take it a level deeper, and that's where I think it starts to get interesting, because most people will say this is an opportunity for Trump and his supporters to learn, what his flaws are, what his issues are. For him, again, what it should look like to be presidential. For his supporters to say, hey, this is what a presidential president looks like. This is somebody we can respect from the other side. So understand that, learn, what it looks like. And there's truth to that. But the much more interesting, or maybe not much more, but the maybe overlooked interesting thing to consider is an opportunity for Democrats or liberals to also use this as an opportunity to learn and get better and maybe improve the situation as a whole. Because at the second level, again, it doesn't take too much, intellectual digging to recognize some of the hypocrisy in it. Because when George W. Bush was president, he was viewed maybe not to the extent Trump is, but pretty close. He was very polarizing. People hated George W. Bush. They thought he was stupid. They thought he was evil. The Iraq War. I mean, there was a whole host of things. They wanted him charged with war crimes. The Hurricane Katrina situation, there was racist calls and all that. So George W. Bush was not a loved president by liberals. And not just in the traditional way, like maybe even like a Ronald Reagan or whatever, where it was just an opposing view. There was a hatred seemingly, right? There was the person that he was, they truly hated. They thought he was evil. So the hypocrisy is pretty clear, in that. And I think the lesson to be learned for Democrats is, hey, maybe step back for a second and think about trying to get back to rational thinking and clear thinking, right? How can you reconcile in your brain that now you're applauding George W. Bush when, whatever it was, I guess 10 or 15 years ago, whatever the time period was, when he was president, you couldn't see past all the things you hated and he was just terrible. You wouldn't have a conversation about him, right? Similar to how people do today with Trump. You're doing that same thing again. Now you're looking back and saying this person is a good person, or at least the speech is good, and maybe you believe he changed or whatever. But it's an opportunity to step back and recognize that, perhaps that flaw in your thinking and this inconsistency. And, I guess because time has passed, and in contrast to Trump, is among the reasons George W. Bush now looks pretty good. But you got to try and keep that perspective, that long-term perspective throughout. You can't always be thinking in the moment, right? We talk about this a ton. Your emotions, you can't let your emotions drive you in the moment because they come and go. Feelings come and go. If you let that define your identity and who you are, you get into a situation like this, right? But whereas where you take the long-term view, which is now what people are forced into doing with George W. Bush, because it's been a long time, things have kind of faded a bit. You can see the good from the bad. You can acknowledge, hey, he did some things, the Iraq War, other things that I would never agree with. But I could see he wasn't a terrible person, right? The goal should be to try and get to that realization now. Take the long-term view now, force yourself into it so you can get to that realization that much sooner. Don't have to wait this long to get there. It's a tricky thing to do without a doubt. It takes all the things we've talked about: mental courage, objectivity, self-awareness, reflection, all that stuff. But that's the goal. That's what you're trying to get to, this exact moment, right? For that person that now thinks, hey, maybe I, again, still totally disagree with George W. Bush's politics, but I can at least acknowledge he's a decent human being now. What stopped you from doing that 15, 20 years ago? Do you think it's him that changed? Maybe, but I would argue you probably don't know enough about him. He's not in the public life anymore to say that he's changed. There's more to it than that, right? It's more on your end that you've changed. Your views of him have changed. So again, I think it's a learning opportunity for Democrats as much as it is for Republicans or conservatives, liberals, whatever, to think about that kind of dynamic that they have going on in this scenario, and how maybe they can use that as a learning tool going forward, right? Because I also think it triggers a reaction from the other side, right? Because the question will be from Democrats, how do Trump supporters still support him after this? Well, I think it's the exact reason of what I was just talking about. I think because on the Democratic side, as they did with George W. Bush, as is happening with Trump now, whether it be warranted or not, every single thing that happens he's attacked. And there's stories that don't deserve to be stories that are made into stories to try and make him look bad. He looks bad enough on his own. You don't have to make him look bad. You don't have to contrive stories to do that. And when you do, it gives the other side an out. It gives them this out to just say, well, see, the media, the Democrats, the liberals, they're all out just to get my guy. They want to make him look evil no matter what he does. So even when he does something evil, now that's clouded to you. You don't see it, right? It's almost Boy That Cries Wolf-esque, in that you've become numb to it now. And you're more likely to let him say these things and be okay with it. Not because you would actually be okay with it normally, but because you're more fighting against the Democrats now who are constantly after him. So again, it's that long-term view. The same thing will happen, I assume, with Trump supporters. 10, 15, 20 years from now, they'll be able to look back and say, hey, he was pretty terrible in a lot of ways. Why can't you get to that point now? There could still be things you liked about him. I liked his straightforwardness. I liked the way he told it like it was. He wasn't a politician. All good. Maybe you think the outcomes for the country are better somehow. That's fine. But you'll be able to acknowledge that maybe he's just a bad person, whereas you can't do that today. If that's the thing, right? It could be any number of things. But I think it's an interesting scenario to help kind of think through some of the ways you should be thinking, some of the pitfalls you fall into, and really trying the importance of taking that long-term view and trying to do that in the short term.